that, I will turn it over, and thank
Okay.
you so much for being here.
All right. Okay. So I want to thank Julie for that introduction, and also for inviting me to be a speaker here. I want to thank all of you for coming out today. And I also want to thank all of the people who manage the logistics for the difficulty of getting me out of Charlottesville here and then back home this evening. So I really appreciate it. Before I begin talking, I want to say that a disclaimer that I'm not an expert on sustainability. Sustainability, in my opinion, is a very multidisciplinary, multidimensional topic, and it ranges all the way from climate change and biodiversity to industrial ecology, green chemistry, and green buildings. And I like to think of these as sort of the macro or high-level aspects or dimensions of sustainability. I'm not going to talk about those. I'm going to talk about what I consider the micro level or local level aspects of sustainability that have to do with people meeting the needs, the daily needs of their lives. And so I'm particularly going to talk about marginalized people who face the challenges of getting water to drink and food to eat and so on, because I think that this is also a dimension of sustainability, and it's the one that I focus most of my attention on. That's what I'm going to talk about today. There's a gap between that micro and macro level that is not, in my opinion, well bridged. And so I think the academe has a lot to do with that, and that the people who are doing this relevant research are not necessarily making doing a good job of bridging that divide. That is, bringing their research down to the people who need to benefit from it. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about my work and what I think I do in that respect. Before I start talking, like I said, I'm more of a servant than an expert. And so I want to acknowledge all the communities and all the people who have borne with me and made me humble in learning, and borne with all the mistakes that I've made along the way. I don't think that there's any body of knowledge that represents this type of work that I do. But to the extent that there is a developing body of knowledge, I know that it was developed at the expense, to some degree, of a lot of host communities. And I've just listed some of the communities and the partners that have helped me develop the little bit that I know. I want to acknowledge them. And so this is what I want to talk about, a different definition of sustainability. The whole idea of sustainability as human needs. I'm going to talk about what constitutes human needs and how those needs are met. And then sustainability as access to those needs, how it might be done so that people have sustained access. And then I will do just one illustrative case study given the time limit, and then talk about other issues. So the question then is, does this thing work, even if you did it the right way? And we'll see. In the background on some of the slides, because of the time limit, I put some pictures and some of the references, some of the publications that are related to the work. So you see some pictures that give the context for what I'm talking about. Hopefully they're kind of sequential. They go from the beginning to where I am today. And so I want to start with when I didn't know what I was looking at. I was starting my PhD at Carnegie Mellon, where we're building this facility out in East Liverpool, Ohio. There's a lot of public opposition to it. And I was a student, was one of those in the opposing group, travel out and protest and all the other things. In the end, they built the facility anyway. It was located near the school. It was in a low-income, mixed-race community. But the opposition, the community groups, were not effective in stopping that facility from being built. In retrospect, when I look at it from the eyes that I now have, I could see that there was a trade-off between the community's concern about their human health and also about their property values, and the society's need for a way to handle these hazardous waste, so we call it sanitation. And so what's the appropriate trade-off? In this case, the environmental authorities made the decision and granted the permit for it, and the community failed in meeting their need or their want because, like I said, I talk about capacity factors. At that time, they didn't have the economic or the political capacity to challenge and maybe to stop the permitting to meet the needs that they had. Right? So that was the first formative type of lesson. And then I did my PhD on the garbage crisis in the Northeast at the time. And what was going on there is that we didn't have the natural resource capacity in most Northeastern states to build large landfills, especially since the environmental laws, Resource Conservation and Resource Recovery Act had been passed and introduced new landfill design criteria. And so one of the cases that came up was the garbage badge, which went all the way from Islip, New York, through the Bahamas, and then back to New York, and ultimately to an incinerator there, because we didn't have that resource capacity. And so the needs in that case, again, was society's need for a place to dump or trash. And of course, most of the communities said, oh, you can dump the trash, we know we need it, but don't put it near me. And so in the end, again, the environmental authorities decide. The communities in this case, no natural capacity. The resolution was that they shipped the waste out, mostly to Pennsylvania and to Virginia, who resisted this. And in the end, the Supreme Court made the decision that trash is an article of commerce. And so they prohibited Virginia and Pennsylvania from interfering with the trucks that were bringing that trash into their states. And so now we have no more of a garbage crisis. We don't have that anymore, but it was a big issue. And so that's what I did my thesis on. And so you have the questions then, are these things a sustainability? You know, is waste disposal a sustainability issue, especially when it involves the trade-off between human health and ecological risk? And so some of the issues that come up is, what is the trade-off between risk and benefit? What's a need versus what's a want? And then, as many of the community residents would say, what is this toxicological risk assessment and the other things that the environmental agencies use to justify the permits that they give? And who trusts it anyway? And so things like environmental justice, sustainability issues, and if so, how do we frame them as sustainability issues? What about things like open defecation? Is that a sustainability issue? You know, when you think of it from the macro level, it's not about biodiversity. It's not a climate change issue. It's not a carbon sequestration issue. So how is it a sustainability issue, right? Because it affects people's daily lives. And so that's what I want to talk about. And so I begin with a definition. And like I said, it's a definition based on my experience. I'm not trying to give a comprehensive definition. Sustainability then is just the ability to provide access to the basic human needs at the desired level and over the planning horizon in which people anticipate having those needs. But you want to do it in such a way that you have the minimal achievable economic, environmental, and social costs, so the triple bottom line aspect, right? So I want to start with that working sort of practicalist definition, and then move on from there. Some definition details, capability versus ability, you know, talking about enabling people to know not just how, but to know why these things are being done. to know where it needs to be done, where it will work, where it won't work, and also to know when. Right? So we can go into that in more detail if you want. There's a difference. I'm using the word capacity because it's in the lexicon, but really what I'm talking about is capability. And the distinction between that is in that picture. You can have capacity. In this case, in Siuna, they have lots of land, and so they have a dump there. So they have the capacity to manage their waste, but the capability to build a sanitary landfill is not something that they have, right? So I'm talking about capability, but because everybody else uses the word capacity, that's the word I use, but really I'm talking about capability. And then sustained access, it just means that if you exceed the recharge capacity or the carrying capacity, the resource will fail, and so you won't have access to it anymore. And so that's the definition that we're going to use for sustained access, right? Under dynamic changes in the environment, the system is resilient. So if it floods, the water supply system doesn't have to shut down because the operator was only trained to use the system in the dry season. And they didn't know what to do to change the filtration rate during the wet season when it floods. And then minimally achievable, it's a little difficult because it's a socially determined item that involves the balancing of cost and risk. And you'll see how it plays out as we go through the rest of the slides. And so I have these 4 questions. What causes people to live in places where they don't have access to water and sanitation and other basic needs? Why does that happen? The need is just a symptom. Or what's underneath that? What's under the tip of that iceberg? If you could find out those root causes, is there a way to address them? And if you address them, will that solve the problem over the long term? So will it be sustainable? And even if people did get access to enough clean water and safe sanitation, how do they make a living where they are? Is that enough? And does that mean that you solve the problem, right? And so all those things are wrapped up together in this micro, local level definition of sustainability. I'll start with the first challenge is, what are the basic human needs, right? And I've partitioned them into primary. These are the needs that you have, which if they're not met, in a pretty short period of time, you will die, right? And so if you don't have access to water or sanitation, shelter, and all these others, the 7 that I have on the list there, your mortality is limited. And in order to meet these needs, in an organized society, we have essential human services, right? And that's just a short way of saying that we have infrastructure. So where we have groups of people with these needs, we meet them through infrastructure, either through some water supply system, some sort of sanitation, some sort of system for delivering energy, and so on. Then we have secondary needs, right? And I make this partition because resources are limited, especially in the most marginalized communities. If you have to make a choice in meeting needs, and I said to you, look, you prefer to invest in education, primary education, like they say in the Sustainable Development Goals, and secondary education, or do you prefer to invest in clean water to reduce the maternal mortality rate, which is also an SDG? You have limited amount of resources. How do you partition that and make these decisions? And so that's why I separated these out into primary and secondary. And this is my list of some of the secondary needs that are in a society. And then there are other needs, other things that we talk about. People say water should be a human right, or people have rights for their personal autonomy, or that people have a right to pass on their property and onto the next generation. And that is a legacy concern, and a legacy is a right or a need of people. All these things are aspects of human need. I just need to clarify them so I can focus with laser-like attention on the ones that are key to my concern, which is, for now, water and sanitation. And just a quick summary, we aren't doing very well, and there are lots of people who lack access to these services. So I'm sure that you all have access to the UN Sustainable Development Goals reports. They come out every 2 years. And so here's the latest information we had on these 7 primary needs. And you can see for sanitation, it ranges from 61% of the people on the planet lack access to a safely managed sanitation system. And then just 11 million people who are listed as chronically undernourished, right? In my opinion, based on my experience, I think that these are underestimates, and that they represent national aggregate averages, but that the real situation at the local level in some communities is a lot worse in some cases, right? And that, I apologize for this slide being clear, I took it straight out of the SDG report. There's some globally regional differences, in particular in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia and Oceania, right? We can see, as the graph shows, access to safe water is a challenge in these regions of the world, Afghanistan and Mongolia there as well. And then, of course, in Sudan, we don't have access to the data, and so that's why, and Libya, that's why they're not there. And then the same thing, even worse, with sanitation, right? So again, standing out is Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Oceania. I want to point those out. And the other part of that is these challenges are worse for people who live in rural areas than they are for people who live in urban areas, right? And so you see the difference between urban and rural is worse in the blue dots are for sub-Saharan African countries than they are for other parts of the world. But consistently, most of the countries fall on the upper part of that chart, meaning urban gets more attention than rural, right? And so I know, and we don't have time for me to ask you why you think that might be the case, but it's the first thing that struck me when I was looking at, well, how do people end up in a place where they lack access to these services, right? And so just to prove the point, there's some other charts, which you can look at in more detail. But again, it's showing most of the pink is in these 3 troubled areas of the world, right? Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Oceania. And that just happens to be where I focus most of my attention, the most difficult, or the worst of the worst, if you want to call it that. Some other things, like I said, other parts of the world fare worse. Rural areas are the worst of the worst. And then there's a significant undercount of the informal settlements in urban areas, right? Not represented well in the data. Partly because they lack defined housing units. And then there's also that challenge of the huge burgeoning youth population in many of these cities, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Right? So when we talk about sustainability as access, the first thing is, why are people living without these services? The Bricker and Brodero study is kind of dated now, but it's the one that most people refer to because they took a closer look and they found that about almost 2/3 of the time, these systems fail within 3 years of the external agent withdrawing from the community. So the infrastructure fails or is not working. And then from the anecdotal evidence from my work, the actual failure rate, when you consider how far the water supply is, or how affordable it is, and things like how often is it on? Do they get their 25 liters per person per day? What's the quality? How reliable is it? When you consider all those factors, the actual failure rate is a lot higher. And so this picture in particular is showing some girls fetching water from the tap in Zimoli, but that tap is only on about once every 15 days for about 2 hours. And then they still have to make a pretty long hike, pushing the water back to their house. Otherwise, they just fetch water from the irrigation ditch that's connected to a river nearby. And so even when we see the statistics by the SDGs, they're not actually representative of what happens. Right? So why? Right? And this is a root causes question. Why is it happening? The capacity factors that I list here are things that I've distilled first by looking at the UNEP reports, especially the reports from field officers talking about their work on building these water supplies and sanitation systems. Back then we didn't have word search or text editing or even statistical pattern recognition. So it was painstakingly going through and looking for the recurrence of what they're saying about what works and what didn't work, and then trying to figure out what's the categories or how do you partition this. And then going through the literature as well to find out, and so eventually we distill these 8 factors that have a role to play in the success or failure of these infrastructure services. Right? And then I'd like to use this to sort of explain them in a little more detail. There's governance, that's institutional, and all the way down to service. We tended to, and the sort of service community tends to respond to the symptom of the problem. So a community lacks access to water, and we build a water supply system. Whereas the root causes of that lack of access to water or sanitation has to do with all kinds of other, like I call, below the iceberg issues. And that if you don't address these issues as well, we get that high failure rate, right? So that's the first sort of understanding that came out of this. You can't just go in and build an artifact. If you do that without making it appropriate, as they call appropriate technology, then you run into some challenges. Question? All right, okay. So I can keep going. The capacity factor approach then comes out of that, and that's most of what I've been working on. I look at common interventions that tend to fix the symptom, mostly are centralized, so they work with the national level government. They tend to focus on urban areas. Not surprising, I showed you the discrepancy between urban and rural access. And because they're focused on urban areas where the housing or the people are close together, they are amenable to centralized infrastructure. Right? So centralized, you build a big dam, you build a hydroelectric power supply, and then lots of connections in a dense urban area, and so you can make the system work there. But those are done with external funds, external people, and so the capacity building locally tends to be limited in those cases. And the investment is definitely top-down, right? Coming from the government rather than springing up from the bottom. And then in the capacity factor approach, sort of tries to complement that. And so shore up and close some of those weaknesses. And so it first tries to find out what are the factors that cause failure. It focuses at the community level, and so it tries to bring all the affected people in to the decision making and then into the implementation. It's rural intensive, right? It also looks at people in informal settlements in the urban area. The emphasis is definitely on bringing the infrastructure as close as possible to the point of use. So that minimizes the footprint, but it also minimizes the capital cost, the upfront capital cost. And so I make an argument later that that aggregate of those small investments will cover the same number of people at a lower cost than a large centralized system would do, and it's much more flexible, right? And then the focus, like I said, is on building those capacity factors, much less on building the artifact. And it also invests locally and sources locally as much as possible to increase the multiplier effect. So if I could distill this and, all this work down into just a few sort of PowerPoint annotations, we begin by doing a capacity factor assessment. So those 8 factors, we look at all the subsets, like you said in the last slide, you saw that, take the institutional factor. Within the institutional factor, there are 3 attributes, and under each one, there's a series of requirements, right? So policies would be, do we have an environmental law, and is there a set of regulations under that law, like the Safe Drinking Water Act, and so on, and then how is it present in that particular community, right? So if you think of it, there's a spreadsheet that has all these individual requirements in it, and we are just looking at the community to assess them on the basis of those requirements. That's what this community assessment is. When we finish that process, we give the community a simple score on a 1 to 5 scale called the community capacity level. And then we surveyed a series of experts on the different options for providing water, providing sanitation, and we asked them to score these things holistically and give them a technology requirement level, a TRL, right? We use those initial scorings to then look at different installed systems, evaluate their success, and then use a machine learning algorithm to update and try to get a more targeted assessment on the TRL for each of these different options. And then we use a fairly conservative rule because we want to ensure the success of the system. And so the conservative rule says, never acquire a technology that's higher than your rated capacity level. Right? So over all these capacity requirements, your net capacity level or community capacity level should always be higher than the required capacity to operate the technology. And that way you're sure that whatever you acquire, you'll be able to manage. And the idea being that as you grow more sophisticated or as your capacity increases, because the system is flexible or modular, you'll be able to modify the system as your capability increases, right? And so you evaluate the choices, the community gets to make the final decision, and then we assist them with the technical expertise necessary to implement it, but they actually do the building. So the next step is, well, how do you do the building? Like I said, we try to use small infrastructure that is as close as possible to the point of need or the point of use. And the attributes of this infrastructure is that it's distributed, it's spread out widely over the target area. It's located at the point of demand. It's evolutionary, so as the community capacity grows, the system can grow with that capacity. It's also adaptive in the sense that if there's a structural or environmental change, that's the water resource changes, maybe because of climate, or because of high level of migration out of the area, you don't need that system as much anymore. You can actually, the community can actually modify their system to meet those needs over time. And like I said earlier, go from dry season to wet season, you're able to respond because you understand how the system works and why you do the things that you do. The system is resilient, like I said, to the operating environment, and then it provides sustained access. In the end, that's what it's all about. It's sustainable because it's there, and it's there for hopefully multiple generations if needed, right? So scheduled access at the desired level over the planning horizon. And so if you put it all together, this sort of approach has these 12 dimensions. Some I mentioned earlier, that is, it focuses on the root causes, targets the community level, so it's meant to complement the top-down level. The emphasis is on building capacity more than on building the actual artifact. It's designed to evolve as the capacity changes. It involves investing as much locally as possible. It takes a portfolio approach in that instead of building a large centralized system, we build a series of multiple smaller systems that serves the same area as a large system would. And this one is a little different. It's an integrated system of services. That is, it's not just water, but because we recognize that water is closely linked to sanitation, we always build both so that when the water supply goes in, people don't defecate on the side of the river or in the water, which increases the water treatment cost, right? So, or they don't throw trash into the stream that we're using as a water supply. And so if we build both at the same time, we sort of reduce the net cost overall of building out the system. The know-how and know-why is part of the capacity building process. And then there's a lot of uncertainty, like I said. I admit it up front. I make a lot of mistakes, and I have made a lot of mistakes. But we learn to bound and build in contingency into the supply systems. And then this whole idea of knowing that you're resource constrained, but you still need to have discipline in setting aside money for the spare parts and for paying the operator and so on. And so this whole idea of sequentially allocating the resources 1 year at a time over the planning horizon is part of the work that we've done. And then building community equity. Who has $50,000 or $100,000 to put in a water supply in some rural communities that are marginalized? So if we got a grant for that from the Rotary International, that money is used as a community mortgage. All the households in the community take a share of that mortgage. They work off about 30% of it in sweat equity, and they work off another 50% of it by paying it back at a rate that they can afford, usually over a 5 to 10 year period. And then those funds can be used to pay for projects in other communities, other neighboring communities. The other 20% of that cost is just investment on the part of the foundation that's given a grant, right? And then finally, this part of each one teach two is just something I learned along the way. As the project progresses, especially if you're working in a rural area, people from the other villages come in to see what's going on. I just observed it. They come to see and then they participate sometimes. And so we began saying, what if, when we almost done, 75, 80% done, you guys began going to the neighboring villages and trying to install a system, right? So you become the experts, you become the me, and they become the you. And so each village teaches the two villages. The idea is that it would be self-propagating and not an experiment, or that work is still in progress. And so finally then, how does the actual implementation process work? I start with this, and I usually ask, why is this amenable to centralized infrastructure, right? And the answer, I think this picture is from Pretoria, is that the houses are close together. And so if you were distributing electricity or water down here, you get a lot of connections per mile or per foot or whatever is the dimension you're using. So you get a high return on your investment. So that's amenable. But this, which is in the community of Shivumo in Limpopo province, that won't work here. You can actually look at this picture and decide, I won't try to put a centralized water supply in this community because it won't be economically feasible. I think the first or second year water treatment system student would be able to make that judgment. And so, well, why do we find these water supply systems that are depending on water pumped from 60, 100 kilometers away. It doesn't surprise you that the water is only on every 15 days for 2 hours at a time, and that 2 hours is not scheduled. So everybody leaves their taps open all the time because there are a lot of pollutants to enter and a whole lot of technical problems as well. All right, so I just want to start with that and show what the difference is. In the centralized system, pardon my crude sort of animation, we have a centralized system serving a range of communities, right? So you have your Puerto Rico electricity supply, it's generated, and then it serves a lot of communities across the island. And it's established practice. We know how to do it. We have standards for it. And so engineers, that's what they do, right? If this system fails, that is, if that centralized system goes down, everybody is out of service, right? And so you may remember the power outage after Hurricane Maria. Everybody was out of power, right? In Dominica, where we are doing some work, they're still out of power, right? They haven't been able to rebuild completely yet. And so in the small infrastructure approach, we're using the each one teach two, and it's a diversified portfolio. We're going to start the first village, and then we bring on the other 2 villages. And then they in turn bring on 2 other villages, and eventually we have this system. Now, if the system in the center goes down, right, it's a highly redundant system, and everybody else still has access to service under that configuration. That's one of the reasons why we think that this is a better approach, especially for low-density housing, right? But it's not widely practiced. The standards are wholly widely variable, so there's no standard. But the assets are flexible and they can be changed. We believe that the total service area, so all those communities, the total capital cost will be lower. And because it's highly redundant, it can work where there's low population density. And the net environmental footprint, we believe, is going to be smaller because the infrastructure in each case is located closer to the point of use. Right? And so these are some of the benefits, including when it's done, the community knows how to do it, and so it empowers them to do it. I like this picture because that guy that you're looking at in one of the villages in the Ciuna district in Nicaragua, he's barely literate, yet he was trained by Agua para la Vida to design and install this water supply system in this community. And so these campesinos, as they call them, go out into these rural communities and they build these water supply systems. So when I was there that day, I was showing me with great pride that they have this chlorinated water supply system that they built themselves, right? And so the case study I want to talk about, in my case, is from Limpopo, South Africa. I began working there in 2008. And the first thing I want to say is that there are 3 lines of sort of governance that have to be negotiated. The most significant one for the local project is the community. It's the Venda region, so it's the Venda people. They operate under a chiefdom. They have a local king. And then this is how it's broken down within that system. Each chiefdom has its sub-chiefs, in this case it's Zimoli district, and then within that there are chiefs in each of the villages, right? So it's just like a government, it's just that it's a traditional government. And then the central or the conventional government is the centralized government in South Africa, then the regional or provincial water authority, and then the Mutale municipality, which covers much of that region. Then they still have a Zimoli, it's just that it's a ward, and they have a ward council representative. But beyond that, then, within the individual villages, there's no personal representative at that level. And then coordinating, sort of working between them, is the University of Venda, which works through the Office of Community Engagement. Venda is a region that you could go to if you didn't want to live under apartheid. It's one of those Bantu lands. And so this is how they have this system still in place. This is just a quick profile. It's one of the poorer of the 9 provinces in South Africa. And the stated water and sanitation rate, this is kind of dated, was 78% and 53% for sanitation. But when we arrived in those 2 villages, 100% of the households were fetching water from the irrigation ditch because the centralized supply was not that reliable. And then the sanitation access, we measured 257 pit latrines for 3,000 people, right? And so if you're using a sort of rough estimate of 4 people per household, they should have had 750 of those latrines. And ideally they would be ventilated, improved pit latrines, not just latrines that you have to hold your breath when you go in, right? So just to quickly go through it, the process. Like I said, it's Limpopo. I've been in the northeastern province. We're right on the border with both Zimbabwe and Mozambique, just outside Kruger National Park. So on this map, you can see that we're working in that area, right up on the border. Just a quick sort of, this is what it looked like when you do this scoring for each of those capacity factors. We're looking at the different options that are available, and we're giving them a score on a 1 to 5 scale, right? So I've summarized all the 100 or so individual things that we rated them on into this table. And then looking at the technology choices that we were considering, this is some of the systems that we looked at for the procurement of the water, to the storage, to the treatment, that is settling any particulates, and then chlorination, and then distribution. Right? So those are some of the options that we looked at before we deciding on the final system in consultation with the villages. And so then summary that was participatory, especially focused on incorporating women into this process. We found that they tend to be more concerned and active in maintaining the system once it's installed. Men play a very heavy role in the beginning, but when you need to change the pump or get the motor rewired if you're using that, women tend to be more engaged, probably because they spend most of the time fetching water if it wasn't working. Young men were doing the labor and trying to get them a skill that would keep them in the village instead of migrating out into the nearer city. The elders who sit in as the village council and the water committee for managing access. And then marginal groups, I mentioned that this is on the border in this case with Mozambique and Zimbabwe. We're doing this work while there were a lot of refugees from Zimbabwe living in South Africa. And so up in the hills, we had several Zimbabwe residents living in those communities. Right? Turns out to be a sort of source of tension because the community didn't want us to reach out to those residents, and they didn't want to be found. Right? Although they live very close to the source of the water supply, and we needed to reach them to say, this is going to happen, but they didn't want to be found. And so we built a system, and we're paying for that today, like some sabotage and some issues like that. Like I said, we're working on both water and sanitation, paying particular attention not to put the water supply too far downhill so that if necessary, people don't have to lug wheelbarrows and 25-liter tanks on their heads going back uphill, even though it's a gravity-fed system, so compromised. This is one of the difficult things to manage as an outsider, but very efficient to manage with a village council. That is, how much the fee should be, how much each household should make, you would think everybody gets an equal share in the mortgage. It turns out that that's not the case, right? Some houses can afford more, some can afford less, and it's those elders, those women on the water committee who have that intimate knowledge, and they go to the house and say, this is how much you'll pay per week, right? Comes out to be about 5 cents per household over 5 years, but works out, right? And then the on-site builder and project coordinator, we didn't consider that in the beginning, and so we actually had to start over twice in the first village, because every time we would leave, spare parts would disappear, or the project would go into disrepair, and then we would always have to lose about 2 or 3 weeks starting over when we came back. Once we got an on-site coordinator, they could continue to work with the volunteers, and things eventually got done, right? So, it's like I said, it's the nitty-gritty sort of day-to-day learning that happened in the process. This was our plan, and I shared it with you because, you needed a plan to engage the community and ensuring the time that we allocated for each one. We thought we'd be done in 2013, and here we are in 2018. The system has been built, but we don't feel comfortable disengaging with that 3-year time limit that they will be able to manage. So every year we still go to tweak things and work with the community then. But we're getting to the point where they will take it over. Actually, the system blew over during the drought. They drained the tanks, which they're not supposed to, and in a high wind it blew the tanks over and ripped out some of the piping. But they repaired it themselves and reinstalled the tanks, right? So I know that things came along. And this is just some of the mapping work and all the, like I said, the day-to-day stuff that happens to get it done. And so it looks really sort of nice and impressive. This is done by community residents, right? They have the GPS receiver, and they're going through and doing all the geocoding and generating the data. All we did was put it on a map to show them. And this is Google Maps. They could see how to do the Google Maps. And I think with a little more training, they could generate these maps on their own, right? This is a picture of the water committee in Chapasha. And this is the capacity building. Right around me is the UVA students, and then outside of them is students from the University of Venda. And then you can see in the forefront of this picture some of the volunteers from the village who are the ones that built the system. So out of the 47 people that we trained over the 10 years so far, we only have 3 people still living in the village and operating the system. All the others have taken that skill and gone into an urban area looking for jobs. That's why I said solving the water supply system is not the end of the process. If people can't make a living or they don't find life satisfactory there, it still doesn't work in the end, right? And people bore with me. We made a lot of mistakes. Things happened. We were using the wrong strength of PVC pipe. And so when they turned the water on, it burst the pipe. All those things happened, and people learned how to do it. And there's some pictures of the community members building out their system. These guys are coming home from their garden plots, and then they're doing this in the evening or in the afternoon, right? So they leave home at 4 in the morning, and then they come home and do this, right? If you ask me to sort of mix concrete, my feet would get stuck in it and it would dry on me. But they're all very capable of doing this. The tanks arrived in the village, no small feat. There's no fixed road to get to this place. So the truck came in, it dropped the tanks off, and then people lifted these tanks and hoisted them up to the point above the village, about 100 meters up in elevation, so we could get the gravity flow, right? So that was several days of literally back-breaking effort to get it done. And then they hooked up the water pipes, And eventually, they had the water supply that then needed to be connected to 11 standpipes distributed throughout the village, trying to achieve 100 meters, no more than 100 meters from any one of the household, right? And like I said, that system's in place and it's working. And so I thought it would be good, instead of talking about a lot of those high-level things, to talk about doing this on a day-to-day basis. It took 10 years just to get it to where it is. And then we didn't keep the people that were trained. We didn't figure out that other piece of the livelihood. So that's constant learning. These are some of the sources of funding. I do want to point out the Heim family, because they've been very faithful, and the Walton family for the South Africa and India, and then Walton family for the work in Nicaragua. And so in answer to the research questions, the root causes are the 8 capacity factors so far. There may be others. We developed a capacity factor analysis and a small infrastructure approach. Will they result in sustained access? So far in the India work, which I didn't talk about, in South Africa, there seem to be some positive results in terms of getting the thing built, but in terms of retaining the people that were trained and the volunteers, that hasn't been successful. The initial project we did in the Philippines was a solid waste project. It's a total failure, right? They're in as bad shape as they were now than they were. But when we did that, we didn't have capacity factor analysis, right? We were just guessing. And then the next stage, of course, is to link this to livelihood and to education and all the other secondary and higher order needs, right? So that's it in a nutshell, but there is a but, right? There's a but. When we come to talk about sustainability, there are all these other issues that are overlapping and competing, right? And so we're very familiar with all of them. They also have a part to play in this whole process. And then most relevant, the whole idea of the new urban agenda, which was in 2016, seems to shift the emphasis to towns and urban areas. And it does raise some concern about what happens to the 60% of people in sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Oceania who still live in rural areas, right? If you emphasize in urban areas at their expense, you're only going to draw more people out and exacerbate the problems there and overwhelm the solutions that you have put in the urban areas. So how do you balance that? And the SDG goals, if you look at the targets and the programs to address the targets, are they integrated, right? So is the poverty target and the work that's been done on the poverty target, how well is that integrated with child mortality or maternal health, right? Are they leveraging each other? My sense is that they don't work that well at leveraging. And then coming back to the higher level, what's the philosophy of sustainability? Is it an environmental issue? Is it a human development issue? What is the coordinating body of knowledge, or they call it the philosophy, to rationalize this? So we don't have haves and have-nots in sustainability, right? And I have students, I try to train them in this sort of open-minded, inclusive approach, and not train them to be sort of narrowly focused on a discipline at the expense of these other contextual issues that surround the work, right? We have a privilege to be able to do research, but we also have a responsibility, I believe, to let that work benefit society. So I'm done for now. Don't know, we only have a few minutes for questions, but I want to acknowledge my current group of grad students, and they wanted me to show you that they just got a Best Paper Award over at the American Society of Engineering Management in October. So I put that up there. All right? So that's what I have to offer. Thank you. Okay. So, any questions? Yes, sir, please. Help me.
Hi, thank you for this fantastic talk. I was really curious about review about monitoring and reporting structures with small infrastructures. I think managing this could be a little bit of a challenge. But do you want to even have reporting, to centralized organizations at all? Is that part of your philosophy?
Yes, it is very important. We don't have a structured way to do that. And part of that is because we didn't know the end point when we were starting. So as the realization came about, all we are doing in that respect is documenting how much does it cost for a nail, how much does it cost for this, what happened, what worked. But the reporting structures to whom? We report to NSF in the annual report to the extent that they fund us, and to all the others. But a centralized repository for this knowledge, I didn't have it, and so I decided to write a book about it called Sustainability and Human Need. My intention is to put everything that I have into that. Yeah. That's the best I can do with that.
Garrick.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Just thank you for that wonderful analytical approach to the big question of why do we fail? Why do we fail to meet the human needs despite wonderful intentions, huge amounts of money, wonderful, brilliant technology? Why do we fail, and how can we do better? So it seems as though you've developed a model that is addressing those exact issues. You parameterized the model. You've implemented that across a wide range. It seems as though that model could be used prospectively and saying, looking across a wide range of projects, saying, what are the chances, beyond your own work, what are the chances of this succeeding? What are the chances of this failing? And maybe in a decade, seeing if it has predictive value in the model. That just seems like such an amazing contribution. So thank you.
Yeah, I have to admit, I hadn't thought of that. But it's a good point that you could use it to evaluate technologies going forward, but we hadn't thought about it. We're too caught up in the things that we're dealing with now. Right. Yes, sir, please. Yeah.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. Regarding the causes of lack of capacity, lack of access to EHS, I didn't see you mention politics, race, religion, ethnicity, so issues of inequality and discrimination. Although in your case study, you did mention the refugees from Zimbabwe. You did mention differences in income among the households, the role of women versus men. In a related point, if I may, when you talked about primary needs, water, sanitation, shelter, and so on, then you mentioned secondary needs, human rights and liberties came among other needs. But without human rights, how do you get water, sanitation, shelter, and so on?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Right. So, yeah, let me start with what I call the socio-cultural capacity factor first, because within that is where I put all those things. I just represented it here as participation, and that you want to strive for the participation of all the different groups within that community. But that includes gender, it includes race, it includes tribe, caste, and all the other differentiations that you mentioned. With the other issue about, was it not social, the second part of the question?
Well, it was a related question.
Yeah.
Without human rights,
Yeah.
at the beginning, isn't that an even more basic need, in a way,
Yeah.
than water, sanitation?
Right. So, the way I would think about it is those other needs, you could almost consider them to be cross-cutting or fundamental issues to the identified sort of practical needs that people have. The baseline are things like human rights that cut across all of these needs, and without them, you don't have access to these. But on a day-to-day basis, say for a local leader in a village who is looking at the lack of access to safe water, it's not something that they think about when they talk about it. But you're aware that it is one of the issues that is involved in the whole way in which you approach it, right? And it also has a lot to do with how you relate to the municipal government and also with the higher level provincial government. If you go to them talking about rights, the door doesn't really open. But if you go to them talking about need and meeting need without high expense to them, then you have a foot in the door. And so that's kind of a practical, operational way in which I treat it. Right? But it's also very insightful that you asked that. Yeah. Okay. I think we're out of time. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay, so I want to make sure that you have these slides. Right, so I'm just going to leave them. Ray told me to tell him who I want to, and I'll just tell him to give it to you.